purpose of this program is to introduce you to tank calibration by linear measure. Basically, tank calibration is measuring the capacity of a tank. You probably know it as strapping. This is the tank you'll see strapped. It's an upright cylindrical tank and has a fixed roof. It's constructed of butt-welded steel plates and consists of 5 cylinders, one on top of the other. Each cylinder is called a ring. To strap a tank, several measurements must be made. For example, the height and circumference of each ring of the tank. Other measurements include the height and density of liquid in the tank, if the tank contains liquid, and the gauging height. From these and additional measurements, a capacity table is developed. Capacity tables show the amount of liquid in a tank at any given height. For example, this table shows that if the liquid height in the tank is 25 feet 6 inches, then the tank contains 46,882.26 barrels of liquid. So what you're about to see is one acceptable method of strapping a tank. It's based on the API Manual of Petroleum Measurement Standards, Chapter 2. This manual contains procedures that, if followed, give accurate tank measurements. Part of the procedure calls for the strapping crew to measure the circumference of each ring of the tank. So let's begin by watching a crew do this. First thing they do is check with the tank farm superintendent. They need to confirm that they're ready to strap and confirm which tank they are to strap. At the tank, they first inspect the shell to determine its condition. Then they check to see that it's already been filled once with a liquid. This liquid must be the same as or greater than the density of the liquid that will normally be in the tank. The reason for this is that the weight of the liquid stresses the tank shell and bottom and stabilizes the tank on its pad. Also, stressing the tank gets rid of distortions that result from construction and ensures that the capacity tables will be more accurate at any condition of fill. All inlets and outlets on the tank must be closed. Normally, if the tank contains a liquid while being strapped, none can be moved in or out. A number should be stenciled on the tank for identification purposes. Also, they find the builder's monogram on the tank. This gives such information as the name of the manufacturer, its erection date, and nominal diameter, height, and capacity. This data gives the crew basic measurements they need to start strapping. They'll put a steel tape measure, a strapping tape, around each of the rings to measure their circumference. But they know that where they place the tape on the ring is critical. It's critical because API says the circumference of each ring should be measured at a distance equal to 20% of the ring width measured downward from the top. For example, when the crew measures the width of the bottom ring of this tank, they find that it's 95 inches. 20% of 95 is 19 inches, so the tape has to follow a path around the ring 19 inches from the top. Sometimes obstructions on the tank make it impossible to use the 20% distance. In such cases, another path is chosen as close to the 20% path as possible. Now, this is fine as long as the strapping record shows the path used. Regardless of where the tape path is, it must be parallel to the top and bottom of the ring. This ensures an accurate circumference measurement. To mark the tape path, first the crew takes a special pole called a strapping pole and measures the 20% distance on it, 19 inches in this case. There are no obstructions at the 20% height on this tank. The top of the pole goes on the top of the ring. A marking chalk secured 19 inches down on the pole marks the shell at the proper distance for the tape path. Notice that he's marking the tape path on the bottom ring first. This is the ring to start on, and you'll see why in a minute. Once the tape path is carefully marked all the way around the ring, the crew gets its strapping tapes. They'll need 2 tapes. They'll use only one at a time, but the tape on the left is special. It's called a standard tape. The other one's called a working tape. This standard tape's 100 feet long, but other lengths are available. Generally, the working tape has to be long enough to go all the way around the tank's circumference. In this case, 200 feet does it. Regardless of length, the standard tape is called standard because it's calibrated by the National Bureau of Standards. The report that goes with it attests to the tape's accuracy under specific conditions. One condition is tape tension at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. To explain, take a tape at 68 degrees, apply 10 pounds of tension to it, and mark a distance, say 100 feet. Then apply 15 pounds of tension to the same tape and again mark 100 feet. Finally, apply 20 pounds and mark it again. Now, all 3 distance measurements are different. Which one's correct? Well, the only way you'd know is to have a standard tape with a calibration report. The report tells you what tension you should apply to get accurate tape readings. But remember, the tension is correct only at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. However, capacity tables reflect tank volumes at 60 degrees. So these temperature differences will be allowed for in the development of the capacity tables. A working tape like this one is not calibrated by the National Bureau of Standards. Instead, the strapping crew has to calibrate the working tape to the standard tape. Now, why not use the standard tape for all measurements? Well, the answer is that if a standard tape is damaged, its accuracy is voided. Plus, you have the expense of replacement, not to mention the time lost while you're waiting for a new tape to arrive. And it's fairly easy to damage a tape while strapping. And that's why the tape path was marked on the bottom ring first. It's the easiest to work with. The crew will measure this ring circumference with a standard tape and use this measurement to calibrate their working tape. We'll see them do this, but first let's review what we've seen so far. The purpose of tank calibration is to allow the development of accurate capacity tables. Tables to show you the amount of liquid in a tank at any given height. Before a crew starts strapping, the tank must have been filled at least once with liquid that's the same or greater density than the liquid normally in the tank. All inlets and outlets on the tank must be closed, and no liquid can be moved in or out of it. Circumference measurements must be made at a distance equal to 20% of the ring width, measured from the top. But if obstructions exist, then another path is chosen. A strapping pole and chalk are used to mark the tape at the proper height. 2 types of strapping tapes are used for circumference measurements: standard and working. A standard tape is calibrated by the National Bureau of Standards. The working tape is calibrated by the crew, who use the standard tape as a basis. The NBS report tells what tension should be pulled on the standard tape to get accurate readings. Since the readings are accurate only at 68 degrees, any temperature differences must be allowed for when the capacity table is developed. If you have workbooks, stop the tape in work exercise 1, then go back to the program. Now let's watch a crew measure the bottom ring circumference with the standard tape. First, they check the number embossed on the standard tape to be sure it matches the number on the NBS report. They want the right tape with the right report. Then a crewman lightly center punches the shell on the marked tape path. This small indentation establishes an anchor point for holding the standard tape. While one crewman anchors the standard tape on the indentation, another makes a vertical score at the zero reading. This marks a zero reading on the tank. Then they extend the tape on the ring. They make certain that the tape stays precisely on the path marks. Using a tape clamp, the crewman gently pulls on the tape to get the required tension on it. Required tension is read from the NBS calibration report that comes with the standard tape. In this case, it's 10 pounds. A tension gauge tells the crew how much tension is being applied. Tension must be sufficient to hold the tape against the tank. Since the tank ring circumference is more than 100 feet, a crewman makes a vertical score on the shell at the 100-foot tape reading. Correct tension is still being held on the tape. After releasing tension and moving the standard tape forward, the crew carefully lines up the zero reading on the standard tape with the 100-foot vertical score. The tape is still on its path. They center punch the shell and anchor the standard tape with its zero reading precisely on the 100-foot vertical score. They pull the required tension and read the tape. Since the ring circumference is less than 200 feet, they read where the overlapping standard tape hits the original zero vertical score. In this case, the reading is 89.560. Notice that the tape is marked in tenths and hundredths of a foot. However, the reading is estimated and recorded to the nearest 1/1000th of a foot. The crew adds this reading to 100 feet. So 100 plus 89.560 equals 189.560. This is the circumference of the bottom ring to 3 decimal places. This figure is also a reference measurement for the working tape. To show you what we mean, first notice that the working tape is long enough to go around the ring in one wrap, 200 feet in this case. They anchor the working tape on the path used for the standard tape. As they pull in the slack, they check to be sure the tape's on path. Then a crewman slides the working tape back and forth to break any frictional resistance between the tape and shell. This is important because when tension is applied to the tape, that tension must be spread evenly over the tape's entire length. If the tape clings to the shell surface at any point, then the tape will be tensioned unevenly, and inaccurate measurement is the result. After breaking surface tension, a crewman attaches the clamp and tension gauge. Then, enough tension is applied on the working tape until its reading is the same as taken by the standard tape. They read and record the amount of tension applied to get the working tape to give the same circumference measurement as that obtained with the standard tape. This tension reading may be different from the tension required on the standard tape. In this case, it's 22 pounds versus 10 for the standard tape. One note: if the tension required to match the working tape reading with the standard tape reading doesn't hold the tape against the tank, apply more tension on the working tape and correct the reading to bring it into agreement with the standard tape. But the correction shouldn't be more than 1/100th of a foot per 100 feet of tape. In any case, the amount of tension that must be applied to the working tape is carefully recorded. This tension will be applied to the working tape to get the rest of the circumference measurements. The working tape is now calibrated. To continue the circumference measurements, the crew measures the width of the second ring. To mark the tape path on the second ring, they use an extension on the strapping pole to reach it. They then place the working tape on the path marks and take in tape slack. They check to be sure the tape is on path. They break the frictional resistance, the surface tension, between the tape and shell, and pull the required tension on the working tape and read it. The crew measures the circumference of the next two rings in the same way. However, top ring presents a problem. It's too high for the extension poles to reach in order to mark the tape path. So a different technique is needed. It involves using two ropes or lines and a metal ring. The strapping tape goes through the ring, and the top line suspends the ring in tape. You'll see what the bottom line's for in a moment, but first, the width of the top ring is measured in order to determine the proper tape path. Then, a path mark is made at the proper height, but it's not practical to mark the tape path all around the ring. It's too high. So the upper line is marked to indicate the height of the tape path. Then, one crewman on the tank roof holds the upper line with its mark at the top of the tank ring. This suspends the tape at the proper path height. Another crewman on the ground pulls on the lower line to keep tension on the upper line. A third crewman pulls in tape slack through the ring. When the tape's in place, the lines and ring are removed. Surface tension is broken, and proper tension is pulled, and the working tape is read. This finishes up the circumference measurements, so let's take a quick review before we continue. To measure the circumference of the bottom ring with the standard tape, the crew anchors the tape and scores the tank at the 0 reading on the tape. They then extend the tape on the shell, being certain it stays on the path marks. Required tension, read from the tape's NBS report, is pulled, and a vertical score is made on the shell at the 100-foot tape reading. The tape's then moved forward and anchored with its 0 reading on the 100-foot score. Tension is pulled, and the tape read where its reading contacts the original 0 vertical score. This reading is added to 100 feet to get the circumference of this ring with a 100-foot standard tape. To calibrate the working tape, the crew places it on the tape path used for the standard tape. They break surface tension by sliding the tape back and forth and apply enough tension to the tape to get it to read the same as the standard tape. This calibrates the working tape. Once calibrated, the working tape is used to measure the circumference of the remaining rings. This after the tape paths are carefully marked. Because of its height, the top ring requires a special metal ring and lines to hold the tape and mark the path height on the top ring. The next procedure in the strapping operation is measuring the shell's height. Shell height's the distance between the bottom of the bottom angle and the top of the top angle. The crew measures shell height and plumbness near the hatch and at 3 other points of equal distance around the shell. They compare the measurements. In this case, all of them are very close to being the same. But if significant differences exist, they must be noted and accounted for. The next job for the crew is to measure the gauging height. Gauging height is the distance from a striking point on the tank floor or on a datum plate to a designated reference point on the gauge hatch, in this case the top lip of the hatch. To measure it, the crew takes a gauger's tape and bob and lowers the bob and tape into the tank until the tip of the bob touches the tank floor, or in this case a datum plate. Then they read and record the distance where the tape hits the reference point on the top lip of the hatch. In this case, gauging height is 43 feet 9 3/8 inches. The crew also reads the height of the liquid in the tank by withdrawing the tape and noting where the liquid cuts it. Here it's 33 feet 11 3/8 inches. Next measure for the crew is effective inside tank height. This is important because effective inside tank height defines the upper and lower limits of the capacity table. Effective inside tank height is the distance from the gauge point on the tank floor, or datum plate, to the top of the top angle, or where the tank contents would begin to overflow. This height must be measured on the gauge path. Notice that effective inside tank height is not the same as the shell height. That's because the tank floor is not flat. One way to determine effective inside tank height on this particular tank is to anchor a line at the gauging reference point on the hatch and extend it out to the top angle of the tank. The line's leveled and the distance between the line and top angle measured. Then, the distance between the line and top angle is subtracted from the gauging height. This is effective inside tank height. Since this tank holds over 500 barrels, the crew has to make a few more measurements. These include the temperature of the tank's contents, the gravity of the contents, and the ambient temperature near the tank shell. These temperature and gravity measurements are important, and allowances are made for them in calculating a capacity table for tanks of 500 barrels or more. To explain, on large tanks, the shell expands and contracts with changes in liquid height. This is called liquid head stress. Now, as liquid moves in and out of the tank, the liquid head stress changes accordingly. The stress change must be taken into account when tank capacity tables are computed. Otherwise, the table won't be accurate at all liquid levels. So the person calculating the capacity table will take the temperature, gravity, and liquid height figures and compute the liquid head stress at the time the tank was strapped. Then they'll mathematically empty the tank and figure the volume. Of course, if the tank were strapped empty, this volume calculation wouldn't be needed. Finally, they'll mathematically fill the tank, adjusting the table for shell expansion as each ring is filled. The capacity table will be correct for any condition of fill. Rejoining the crew, let's watch them wrap up. All they have to do now is measure the elevations and sizes of the various appurtenances like manways and so forth. Finally, the crew checks in with the tank farm superintendent. He gives the crew a copy of the as-built prints of the tank. These provide the tank table department with ring thickness, bottom, and appurtenance details. The strapping report is signed, and the crew heads for the next job. Okay, let's do one final review. Several height measurements are important to the strapping operation. Shell height is the distance between the bottom of the bottom angle and the top of the top angle. Gauging height is the distance from a striking point on the tank floor or on a datum plate to a designated reference point on the hatch, here the top lip of the hatch. Liquid height is read by noting where the liquid cuts the gauger's tape when it's withdrawn from the tank. Effective inside tank height is the distance from the gauge point on the tank floor or datum plate to the top of the top angle or where the tank contents would begin to overflow. In tanks of over 500 barrels capacity, the temperature of the tank's contents must be taken, as well as the gravity of the contents and the outside temperature of the tank shell. These measurements allow calculations to be made to compensate for liquid head stress, the tendency of a large tank to expand and contract as liquid is moved in and out of it. The final measurements are the elevation and sizes of tank appurtenances like manways and so on. And finally, the crew gets the as-built prints that will be needed to make critical calculations when computing the tank capacity tables. If you have workbooks, work exercise 3.